Thanks for being here. Again, I think that as kind of advertised, I'm going to do kind of informal, just talk about my own work. Kind of judging by the audience and who knows me or not knows me, I thought it'd be easier just to kind of do something that's a little encyclopedic. There's probably way too much information in here. I think I have like 50 slides, so there'll probably be times where I just say next, unless you guys have to ask questions, which you can do at any point. This piece is kind of a little older, but it's indicative of kind of my process. I kind of have a home studio where I do most of my carving, kind of carving on easels. Mostly make relief prints, if you know me, of course. So you can kind of see the block that I'm carving from, one of the impressions that's currently in process, me kind of carving in response to that, and then the kind of the final piece that's there. And again, if you don't know a lot about printmaking, woodcuts are essentially just big stamps that I'm kind of printing over and over again, creating the image. You can go for it. Aww. So a little bit of background. I'm a Midwest boy. I grew up in Jeff City, Missouri, like I was telling Matthew a little bit ago. Family was from Iowa. Both my parents were kind of, typical middle class. My mom was a grade school teacher. My dad was an accountant. Both my parents had grown up on farms, so a lot of times it was like holidays was going to visit my grandma and family. So you can see me and my younger brother, and then me and my cousins over there. Definitely kind of a shy, introverted, bookish, creative kid when I was young, liked to draw. Definitely when I grew up in Central Missouri, I kind of got through high school. I was a good student, but not a very ambitious or motivated with like my long-term goals. Kind of went to the University of Missouri because it was close to where I grew up and because that's where a lot of my friends were going. Next slide. But when I got to the art program there, I did fairly well, really enjoyed the process. I think around the time I was a junior, I took a night class on the recommendation of my color design teacher from this crazy adjunct teacher named Thomas Andrew Huck, who was making these elaborate woodcuts. He was only a few years older than me, actually. He had just graduated from WashU, and he had moved to Columbia to kind of with his wife when she was going to veterinary school. He was working adjunct at MU and also working at Ace Hardware. I think during the first semester I was there, he got fired from Ace for stealing mat board. But during the time I was there, he went from kind of being an ambitious young artist to selling work to the WashU Museum, to selling work to the Fogg Art Museum at Harvard, to selling work to the Whitney within a period of about 2 semesters, and needed to make enough. Was ambitious enough that he needed a print assistant. So during that time, I kind of became his print assistant. Have a large collection of his prints from that time period. And also during that time, I think that he was kind of the first artist that showed me that kind of contemporary art is sort of a real thing, that art isn't just kind of in books. So it was kind of, he seemed interested in the same kind of aesthetics that I was from, he's interested in comic books and rock and roll, whereas a lot of the other teachers I kind of worked with at that time, I think we were kind of into like art history, which I enjoyed as well, but it felt, in a lot of my other classes, kind of art felt dead, and in Tom's classes, everything felt very contemporary and alive. When I was, that works. Okay. I would also say there was some other artists on there, Bill Fick, Michael Barnes were all kind of artists that he brought in when I was a student. Here's a bad but fairly ambitious woodcut from when I was an undergraduate at MU. You can move on. Some other influences, I think another thing I really liked about printmaking was, or that was well explained to me, was kind of the ability to disseminate a lot of information quickly, that you're kind of making this matrix that you can then reprint over and over again. And I think that kind of history really appealed to me, the kind of aesthetics of the line quality. When I took printmaking, it all made my drawings better, and I think that I really enjoyed that. But I also liked that kind of, all these sort of embedded kind of tropes that happen with printmaking, that it's always been used as a form of communication. Lots of printmakers like Honoré Daumier have gone to prison for kind of using the medium as like a way to sort of express their political or sort of polemic views. And I think that baggage that comes with making a print is also partially why I really like the process, like the medium. As an undergraduate, like others, I also kind of enjoyed art history. Whoops, that should have been changed. My favorite class, as opposed to like Shannon's Borough class, my favorite was the Northern Renaissance. I think I enjoyed just how visually dense the images were, how kind of I could recognize and describe all the things in the images, but the kind of whole didn't make sense. There's this sort of, whether it be through time or through that idiosyncratic vision of the artists, that there was something about having to decipher them and them not being decipherable, and that was kind of what was interesting for me. In the contemporary sense, I kind of feel like when I watch a foreign movie without the subtitles, I can still kind of understand what's happening, but it's like sort of that mystery of not being able to totally communicate that what makes it compelling. I still think that kind of really influences how I think about my own work, this sort of more is more mentality, and the idea that the work can be very personally idiosyncratic and it doesn't have to totally communicate it for people to still be interested in it. Next. Graduate school, I left MU on the advice of Tom and ended up studying with Lloyd Menard at the University of South Dakota. And South Dakota doesn't feel like it would be necessarily the hugest art mecca, but over the time I was there, Lloyd had really cultivated this idea that he would bring in lots of visiting artists and have lots of workshops as a way to kind of work around the idea that it was kind of sort of an isolated spot. Another early bad print, I think, for my first semester when I was in graduate school. Next slide. It's funny how much my work changed during that time. My work became a lot more abstract. I think these influences of when I had worked in a entomology museum as an undergraduate for my work study kind of plays into that. Or again, my interest in sculptural forms, pottery, even though I was never a great thrower, I always like to draw them. I think, when you go to grad school, I think a good program will kind of push you out of your kind of comfort zone. It's funny that kind of looking back, I feel like that I went to graduate school as a very young student. I think I was one of those people who graduated. I had a July birthday, so I graduated from high school right before I turned 18, graduated from undergrad right before I turned 22, and so I kind of entered graduate school probably almost too young. But I still found that dialogue that I found kind of worked for me at the time. I feel like I had really kind of great dialogue and conversations with my faculty. Next slide. But I do find that kind of fairly soon after I graduated from USD that change of location, that change of dialogue did start to change the work. So again, I think this is all work from like my thesis exhibition, these sort of intense etchings. Lloyd's definitely known for his etching and aquatint, and I think that's kind of really what I learned a lot technically in graduate school. Also just a lot of formal things. I think before going to grad school, I was really kind of trapped into how the physics of the world work, like gravity had to work, proportions had to work, and I think this work really kind of changed my idea that art can just kind of be nonsensical in kind of a compositional, spatial way. One more slide. So we're kind of postgraduate. Like I said, it's funny how I feel like it was this kind of slow develop process going from kind of this abstraction back into kind of figuration and these kind of steps. Printmaking definitely has that intermediary process which kind of slows you down and gives you time to think. It is funny that with this work, I feel like the themes that are very kind of externalized, whether it could be kind of reading books or listening to the news, kind of influence kind of what I make. I've always been a little bit more of an external art maker. My work isn't very internal or cathartic. It's more about needing to kind of respond to kind of what I see or read or kind of discussions of the people I have, whether it be about well, this is a good way to go. Okay, so I think since kind of graduating, I think that a lot of my influences are as much about more associated almost with kind of fiction, with literature, than it is kind of often with a lot of art references. Those are there too, but I really like the books and things I read. Hey, Violet. I definitely think that kind of, especially fiction that uses the kind of the trope of fiction, that sort of convention as a way to speak about something else. I always think about using kind of the comparison of Jules Verne to H.G. Wells as a good kind of counterbalance, that both of them were kind of science fiction writers. But when I think about Jules Verne, he's kind of like the Star Wars of kind of science fiction. It's all about sort of the events, the big kind of explosions. Versus I feel like H.G. Wells, he's using that science fiction, whether it be the Island of Dr. Moreau or The Invisible Man, it's kind of a lens to talk about something else. You know, I think that the type of fiction that I enjoy, things like Orwell or Vonnegut, are kind of that same thing. They're using the construct to talk about the human condition or how power corrupts. And I kind of think that I see my art as being that same way. It's kind of using the conventions of figuration, the conventions of narrative, but I'm kind of just using that as a sort of stage to talk about other things. And you know, in printmaking, like I said, it has those conventions too, and whether or not you kind of play into those or not is important. Other contemporary artists I really still enjoy, even though I think Paul Arago's died in the last few years. But again, I feel like, again, when I look at the work of Paul Arago or Walton Ford, again, it kind of reminds me of those Bruegel and Bosch paintings, where I kind of recognize all the parts, but I don't quite understand the story, but I want to. And I think it's that inability to kind of figure it out that actually kind of keeps it intriguing, keeps you coming back to the work. Oh, I always think that it's also important to point out, you know, that, you know, we live with another artist, that you know, I just heard Kane talking about, you know, being around other artists makes you competitive, and that makes you a better artist. So I think pointing out that kind of living with another artist who works in a very different way, but still has a lot of the same aesthetic concerns, and you can bounce off your ideas onto, is really important. So I think kind of being around Erica and gleaning all of her good ideas and stealing them has always been really important, an important part of my art making. I think I have a couple more of her prints. And she's also a printmaker, so it's kind of fun to be able to talk to her about issues of color and sort of technical things, and that goes back and forth. Okay, let's get into some more of my work. So, you know, I do think there's some kind of broad themes that I feel like I work with over and over again, and I kind of have structured the rest of the presentation to be that way. I mean, one of the big things I kind of intentionally do is just deal with portraiture. I feel if I lived 200 or 300 years ago and had to function in the world and still be an artist, I would probably be a portrait artist. I just like the conventions of it. I usually tend to use portraiture in one of two ways. One is to kind of use that idea of almost like patron portraits, you know, where you want the figures to be recognizable, you want them to be slightly appealing, but I also kind of like to layer that with that idea of kind of symbolic portraits. You know, when you see an image of John the Baptist, you know it's John the Baptist because of these kind of visual conventions of him, you know, standing in water and having a staff. And so I kind of like to use those tropes, or the like more like allegorical portraits. If you think of a portrait of a winner, it might have certain kind of accoutrement to it. And I kind of feel like the portraits I do of people kind of function that way, but with that idiosyncratic placement of symbolisms on them. This good examples, you know, the One-Eyed King is of a portrait of a guy named Ed Ford, who was the chair of department that Erica and I worked under. So making him kind of the One-Eyed King, the kind of king of diamonds, was part of the symbolism in it. You know, he was definitely kind of a spicy, aggressive person. So giving him that kind of sight hound is sort of his animal symbol. And then this is in Nebraska, so they're having that kind of threat of stormy weather. Kind of, he was a little bit of a doom and gloom sort of person. Yeah, a little bit of working process. Again, I have portraits of other things, but I like having my little sort of thumbnail sketch on there. It's rare that I do really kind of intense preparations before I start drawing on the blocks. Usually I'll come up with just little 3x4 fast doodles, and then I'll put all my effort into the actual drawing on the block and carving on the block. Portrait of our old dog, Homer, and this idea of just like, pets to me feel like these sort of like part friend companion, but also like this forced relationship that you put them in, where you sort of force them to be part of your family, and they can't talk about it and really tell you they don't like it. So, you know, they kind of get to see everything you do. Those portraits I'd done of Eric and we'd have these demons that kind of symbolize us a little bit, and for Homer having this sort of donut demon seemed really, really important. One nice thing about printmaking too is how much the medium can allow for multiplicity. I definitely am one of those people who I would say was a fairly traditional printmaker. Once I kind of come up with my block and print, I tend to print these sort of stable editions on paper. Most of my prints I then frame and then kind of display in kind of for gallery settings. One thing I do still enjoy though is that ability for variation. Some of the prints up here, if they're proofs, often they're trial proofs or color proofs, so you can see variation within the prints. When I did this print, I intentionally, when I did an artist workshop, had the students I work with play around with color, and after we made some color proofs, we just decided to do 2 different smaller print editions rather than one kind of large one, because we really couldn't settle on which kind of color variation we liked best. So this is one of my prints. We'll get to the end, but people always ask me about the process or how many layers things are. I was smart enough to document this one in process. So you can kind of see the drawing that's on the block. I usually use either birch plywood or even just MDF board to do my carving. Some of the colors that are drawn on the block are more just representative of my array of Sharpies in my collection, not an array of what the final color is going to look like. The surface is always just coated first with gesso, and it makes it really easy to see where you're going to carve away the block. So kind of what that first layer of printing would look like. You can see the block here, the print pulled from it. There's some areas within the image or on the block that look a little shinier. I actually use kind of stencils to prevent the ink from offsetting onto the paper in certain areas. So you can kind of see what that first layer of printing would look like. Again, certain areas have been carved away, but some areas just haven't been printed because of the stenciling on the block. Next one.
So can I ask real quick?
Yeah.
Can you go back to that?
Yeah, totally.
So then you're using a multicolor like laying
Yeah,
down.
so rather you lay the ink on with rollers, and I'm just having yellow ink on the slab over here, green ink on the slab here, the big roller will roll. And this one I might have even been kind of jankier, that I might have had one roller that I rolled up here, one on the bottom, that I might have had a smaller roller that was blended that I could kind of, yeah.
Then typically how many of those would you run before you?
Oh, that's great question too. So with most of these prints, they're done in reduction, where I will use the same block to print all my layers. So I have to print all my pieces of paper first, because once you carve away, you can't put it back. So yeah, so I usually make, if I think I want 15, I'll make 25. And some of that is playing with color and testing color, and some of it is just in case things go wrong later. A little bit of Murphy's Law. So second layer, what it would look like, proofed on the paper by itself. Again, I've carved away more of the block, but I have other places that I'm stenciling. And then what the second layer looks like over the third layer. Even though it's not, like I'm kind of a bad painter, but I really like color and color interaction and layering. And I think with this print, there's an intention of like going from a warm layer to a cool layer, and knowing that by printing the purple violet in a transparent layer, that I'm going to get this kind of neutralization in certain areas. I'm going to get the saturation in other areas. Next layer. So the other way I will stencil that is what I call kind of like Martha Stewart stenciling on a big piece of Mylar that'll cover the entire thing. I will cut out spots just where I want to selectively print. Use a roller just to roll it onto those spots. That piece of Mylar gets pulled back so the ink's only in certain areas. So you can kind of see what the block will look like with the inks, what the print on a piece of newsprint would look like, and then what the third layer would look like over the first 2 layers. I don't think I have any of those handy separated layers on the next one, so we'll just kind of go for it. Again, as I'm kind of going through my layers, I'm kind of going from kind of desaturated colors to more saturated. So probably my earlier inks I print before the blue had a lot of transparent base in them, so that they would intentionally blend a lot. I can tell these later layers, again, the amount of transparent base is going down, and the color saturation is going up. And there is this kind of Venn diagram, hopefully, that's happening, where if I can make it spots with my 4th layer touch pure paper, it's going to look like blue, but where it lays over the other layers it's going to look neutralized. And they're kind of getting that foil of saturation from all your colors plus neutralization from them overlapping the earlier layers tends to make it feel like a more layers than you actually have printed. So again, 4 layers gets it look like 9 colors if you can kind of play in your image right. Red layer, and I think all that's left after this is the key. There's definitely a little bit of a painterly process to this in the fact that I don't always have everything decided beforehand. Sometimes I just print 1 or 2 and like, oh, that color interaction's god awful. Okay, let's change the slab, change the color, and then go. I think that with some of the earlier prints, especially from undergrad or grad school, I was kind of mapping things out and pre-planning them. In some ways, in a funny way, we'll get to other prints later, but I kind of do that now just because of the wonders of technology with Photoshop. But I kind of like that the risk reward, sometimes the color interaction isn't good, or sometimes they get a little muddy, but that ability to kind of make mistakes is kind of what makes it compelling to make as an artist too. Last layer. Yeah. The print's up there somewhere. And I brought a lot of the prints with me, so if you always want to look at them afterwards, see what they look like when they're real size, we can do that too. Of course, texture plays a role too, forcing yourself to use different tools to get different texture variation. All right, a couple more of these. So, I definitely also these portraits that aren't necessarily of people. For me, they feel like portraits that kind of relate more to like Arcimboldo, or these kind of portraits of things that have become animated. And that's kind of layered on top of the fact that you see that a lot just in contemporary pop culture too. When I think of old things like Voltron and Transformers and all that stuff, I think influences this work on a certain level too. There's definitely a intentional meeting of kind of a knowledge of kind of old school art history and making these art history illusions, but also making work that feels very I can relate to the things I liked as a kid, like Marvel comics and just kind of doodling for doodling's sake. Again, I because of how I kind of theme things, I think this area kind of caps off a little bit with these portraits I did in the last few years of kind of antithetical figures, whether that be, I think I did 4 of them, and I'll really try to pick, intentionally pick villains or kind of anti-heroes that were decapitated in their stories, whether that be Grendel or Medusa, or I think the other 2 I did are the Jabberwock, and it's in the next slide. Oh, and Goliath, of course. And again, I still think that these ones are fun in the fact that I think trying to make the narrative of the story that they come from to be part of the images was really important. And again, it's kind of using a little bit of the conventions they come through. Like when I envision the Jabberwocky, it's relying on visual sources like the Muppets version of the Jabberwocky, and trying to find ways to make the figures more empathetic. There's definitely my version of the monster from the Lewis Carroll poem. It intentionally looks a little bit more like a rabbit. I want it to both be something that feels a little vicious, but also feels like it's more the victim of the story rather than the just kind of the manson foe, like it's kind of portrayed in there. And again, if I can make secondary illusions, that just makes me more interested, like intentionally making the son who's kind of narrating that poem look like Donatello's David, because that feels like that follows into that story. And often these kind of have these secondary references. I recently read Malcolm Gladwell's, I think is it Outliers? Is that the one? No. Anyway, the one that kind of starts with the premise of talking about David and Goliath and how Goliath really is kind of more the victim in that story, partially because they believed he couldn't see very well. He was blind from his situation. There's also an intentional kind of play with anachronisms. Would you go back one? Like putting the beer cans on Grendel's head, which doesn't really make sense for Celtic myth, but when you're kind of trying to visually describe to a modern audience that the people in town were always kind of drunken and getting mad at Grendel and what bothered him, it seems more visually to make sense to have something that relates to today, like beer cans, rather than just having a story that kind of fits with the immersion of that time. Or again, or depicting that moment in which Medusa's turned into a Gorgon, making it somehow contemporary, like she was just coming back from the store with her groceries when that instance was happening. And that kind of adds a contemporary layer that kind of makes it more relatable. Advanced 2. So I think all these started as just big excuse me, pen and ink drawings on Bristol paper. This process is different in the fact that it's really kind of influenced how I do a lot of my screen prints now, where after I do my drawing, I will scan it and then digitally kind of figure out all my layers and actually make my positives through working with Photoshop. So I think I have a slide of that too. So Photoshop, you can see the original backgrounds hidden below layers, and I'm kind of developing the color layers based upon that. So, if there's another kind of broad theme in my work, it's this idea of kind of intentionally playing, like I said, with that pastiche, that kind of convention of visual narrative and mythology, or the sense of folklore, to try to make these kind of narratives that kind of function in some way, even if they're, again, that story is a little more obfuscated, or if it's trying to take a story that feels really simple, like this sort of Mary Magdalene figure kind of contemplating in the wilderness, which came first, the chicken or the egg, but trying to present that in a way that feels more mysterious or feels more kind of lost. Or same thing with my figure, like kind of like that kind of classic folklore trope of like someone walking through the forest and being kind of tested or challenged by the devil. How do you kind of convey that in a visual format? I have my kind of my blue devil drinking Starbucks, sitting on a stump, and he's sort of just his presence is kind of infiltrating this person's head. And so how are you trying to make that function visually with the smoke kind of coming out as this kind of ominous form, and then having the figure speaking to himself in a way that at least feels like an entrapment, and how do you make that work visually? Let's do more of these. Again, I think that, like I talked about, my work's often influenced by kind of what I'm reading or what's happening in pop culture. I think when I started Sapient Plans and Sacred Intentions, in my sketchbook I had notes from the same moment that, it was I think in the same week, Dolly, the first sheep who had been cloned was in the news at the same time that creationist museum that's really close to us opened. I think that happened at the same time, and something about that clicked in my sketchbook. And I've been reading about, I think, like Greek philosophers or something, and this idea of like knowledge versus belief all came together in this sort of retelling of like an Adam and Eve picture. So we have Adam and Eve, but Eve's holding this sort of GMO apple, which again I visually made work by making it a cow apple. And then and she's kind of in some ways is also kind of the scientist, and that's sort of the science side of the picture. And then you have kind of Adam on the left hand side is sort of the more religious side, with the snake handler, half pagan, half spirit. And kind of just sometimes it's interesting just to kind of take all those visual symbols, mash them together, and see how people respond to them. Kind of the way I kind of felt when I saw that thing about Dolly and the Creationist Museum happening at the same time. And that's one of those prints too that once I kind of decided when I was doing everything else fell together, to have the background have both oil derricks and dinosaurs in it. To have the sort of altered versions of the Olsen twins being the Cain and Abel in the image, or having, again, to have one of the twins holding the two-headed sheep, even though I didn't make it perfectly symmetrical, and then having the other one hold the beehive, which again has its own kind of religious connotations. Just all seemed to work. Yeah, that's right. Again, these ones are maybe a little simpler, but still have this kind of sense of narrative, in part by just putting characters within a space. I think, and even though they're kind of these mythological beasts, it's kind of re-envisioning them in kind of like how they would exist in today's world, where we don't have that same kind of, again, it's almost like the portraits I did of the villains, that, you know, having references that fit them in today kind of makes them more kind of approachable, or more kind of us kind of realizing the sort of banalness of our daily lives. So having a unicorn that's in a park with a monster truck and a person who's, you know, eating a Happy Meal just seems to be like that's where you would find a virginal figure that unicorns are supposed to come to today. Or again, if there was some sort of, you know, modern chimera, would probably be this large domesticated beast that might very well just be something for like a pastoral commodification, like, you know, cattle would be. You know, dealing with black and white, I find actually in some ways can be a lot harder than dealing with color. We were trying to describe everything with just black and white and texture. You know, trying to deal with something like how do you describe a rainbow in that way can really be kind of challenging. The image on the left also has a secondary kind of influence, where I have another art friend who had been a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He was a TA for Kerry James Marshall, who was really famous and wasn't there very much. I think he got a little frustrated that the teacher professor really didn't give him much prompts on how to teach the drawing class. So at one point, Joseph told the class that he wanted them to all make a drawing with a unicorn, a monster truck, and a rainbow in it. And I'm like, oh, I'll take that challenge. You know, yeah, go ahead. But again, this almost kind of feels like it's a intentional retelling of kind of mythological figures in a kind of contemporary setting, which for me, you know, I kind of use it from the perspective of being really interested in art history, and also as a kid being really into things like Greek mythology. But I realized when working on one of these, I had or maybe not one of these, but later on, or thinking back, I had a roommate who would always be on video games playing like World of Warcraft or some sort of other mass MMO game, and the idea that they would be talking about, that dialogue of talking about dragons or devils at the same time, he'd be like in front of a computer with the headset on. There's almost like some sort of personification of those things. Whether it be just the mermaids. I think I made this piece right during the kind of BP oil spill, so having them kind of in this gyre of like junk and crud off of the coast seems like, it just feels like where they would be today. Or again, the portraits of mythological creatures that are probably, again, would just in today's world be using recliners and utilizing the Roombas. You know, the idea that, you know, I kind of, to make this sort of talk work has sort of arbitrarily kind of separated the work, but really, you know, that idea of portraiture, that idea of kind of being interested in narrative, being interested in kind of myth, all kind of often kind of defy those easy sort of categorization. You know, this portrait of my dog as a Cerberus, or this kind of envisioned Colossus outside of Evansville, you know, as a portrait of another printmaker, Ryan O'Malley. And, you know, I think that it's nice when those kind of layers all kind of come together. Or again, this most recent thing that kind of fits within this section, I went to Youngstown State last year. This is the print I made there. But you can kind of see the working process. Here's my block, one of the blocks I took with me, the final print on the left-hand side, you know, kind of using the print as an opportunity to talk about, you know, in some ways it's a personal reference. The artist who invited me in, I had done another artist event where he had also been a participant, so I did the portrait of the person who invited us to meet at the first place. That kind of where I first met Joseph was through at Hobson Walker, but then it also kind of functions this idea of the like an underground, you know, underwater beast, you know, that kind of almost like Kraken thing, and then kind of the whole print being more this trope of kind of blissfully kind of being on the surface, kind of ignoring what's below you. You know, there's also this thing that happens a lot with my work where I think really intentionally I like to make those art historical allusions. There's been a lot of them before too, but sometimes it's really, really intentional. Whether it be this kind of print I did a few semesters ago, Land of Plenty, which is kind of almost a really intentional retelling of Bruegel's Land of Cognate, which I feel like we kind of function in, in the kind of original Land of Cognate. It's this like mythical place where you had to first eat your way through like a cloud of fat in order to get there, and then once you got there, animals would just die and cook themselves in front of you, and you could eat whatever you want. I kind of feel like that's what we have now. We have convenience stores and fast food restaurants, and we don't ever have to, we can just be on our phones and have food delivered to us. So it's kind of like a personification of that. And those funny things too, like I really like using almost the antiquated presentation in my intaglios to feel like old prints. So having the title within the print itself, to have the information kind of reminds me a lot of when I kind of look at prints from the 1800s and before, and then specifically of the Havel print we printed, the Audubon print we printed here a few years ago. We're really getting to see that and see how well that's all inscribed in the plate. Seems like I get another way to kind of make those allusions to art history, whether it be kind of thematically, but also just in sort of context. Again, I think this first print I made when I moved here, and I liked this sort of marriage of two places that don't necessarily go together, and so I kind of there's the visual adding of the landscape, but then turning the two figures from Botticelli's Primavera into kind of like the typical Portlander versus like the typical kind of Southern Belle has made sense for the image. And sometimes it's other things. I know there's the Mano Ponderosa, which is a kind of a religious kind of image that happens over and over again. Eric has all of several devotional candles, but use that sort of trope, but then kind of rather it be kind of taken out of like a religious context and more of a secular context to talk about different images. Oof. My voice is getting tired. We won't stop here, but I think this is kind of that culmination of those things. I made this kind of large print that was this sort of wanted to talk about kind of where we're going, or this kind of like, again, this polemic about where we could be going, using the Tower of Babel as like this theme, but also just talking, kind of imagining this post-apocalyptic world without anything in it except for us and our leftover garbage. But the image itself, if you go to the next one, there's process shots in here. There we go. Of kind of the references I use for the image, definitely Bruegel's Tower of Babel, but then also like Malay's figures from when he painted in southern France, the kind of the farmers of that time, definitely kind of were direct visuals that kind of get reused in the big print. We can step back. Oh, there's the printing process. The print's down there. Probably the biggest woodcut I've made. Big enough where didn't have a press here for me to print it on, so I had to print it at home to help the students. Questions? No, it's okay. We can probably advance. It's funny that I made that print, it's been a few years ago, probably 2018, 2019. It feels like a lot of the pieces I've been making lately, and kind of in my thoughts getting ready for a show I'm going to have this summer, are kind of using that print as a reference, even though I'm now making these pieces that are more lithos and screen prints. Printed in more recently, the next one, for a portfolio that I got invited to from an artist from Atlanta. It also kind of fits into there. And it is funny how kind of events kind of influence what I'm making. This was for a portfolio called The Dream Deferred, which was supposed to be about kind of the progress or lack of progress in like social justice in America. And I had all these, I was having trouble kind of getting into it and identifying with it, partially because of context. And then while working on these drawings I've been doing of the Southern Confederate generals' statues are being taken down, the war in Gaza started, and it's funny that all the destruction images from that somehow really reminded me of the earlier drawings I had done of this sort of this kind of after this, and so it was easy to kind of sort of build those two ideas into an image that felt like it made sense within that context. It is weird with the drawing because I like that Maxwell's drawing. I occasionally get into this kind of fascination of just drawing detritus, things like trash, and how that can kind of both have these recognizable aspects, but it also becomes really abstract really fast. You know, I've kind of seen that interest is built up and see it in different images in the Sirens of Decline, the mermaid image, but also just like the Land of Cognium. We just like that plentifulness just eventually just kind of feels like visual static. And like I said, I think that history of printmaking to be very talking about time and place, and kind of politics and kind of the culture we live in, it's hard to not poke the bear a little bit with some of my work. And I definitely think that, I'll stop there. This works too, but again, I feel like that there's that layering. Like it's really easy. When I was trying to figure out this print for a political-based portfolio, using something like if I get stuck using another work from art history as a reference, so using Burke Fuseli's image of the nightmare, and kind of reprocessing that in kind of a contemporary setting, I feel like it made a lot of sense. And because there's already that kind of convention to work from, it's like how much do you fall into that, or how much do you deviate that? This one's pretty, again, these tend to be kind of hit you over the head rather than whisper in your ear sort of images. So it makes sense to kind of just lean into the convention. Okay. But these, I realize again, looking at these, I've been doing these since graduate school, or more over the course of 15 or 20 years. These ones are, again, probably 15 years old, but when I first moved to California, I met Erica. I only lived in California for 1 year, but it was the year that the entire state decided to vote Arnold Schwarzenegger as their governor, so making a print sort of about this whole cult of personality with his trophy wife and his staff, and his using some Hollywood phrasing to gain power, which is, I think, the phrase that the alien in the Day the Earth Stood Still uses to control the monster. Kleptu Verada Nictu. Or again, I think around that same time, we were still have all these kind of wars in the Middle East where we were kind of trying to put out fires with war machines, and a little more abstracted. And sometimes they're just based upon other things too, like again, really be interested in like Michael Pollan and kind of where food comes from, at least kind of influenced some of these prints I was doing back when we lived in Lincoln, or just the idea of what now feels more precedent about, like, this sort of topsy-turvy world where maybe we go to some island thinking we can just take over, and then suddenly we become kind of the prey and not just the predator. There's plenty of work that I make that doesn't fit into any of these categories. I have plenty of these non sequitur sort of pieces. Often they are prints that I do for portfolios or as invitations to other things. I think that part of printmaking is also really nice too, that these are usually one image that's in a collection of prints that were made for a specific theme, and knowing when I can kind of need to lean into more of like why the show's been organized. But there's plenty of work that I can't really easily classify into being about mythology or being about portraiture. And that kind of segues into the work about students. Every semester I try to do some sort of portfolio exchange with the students in my classes, and that's also its own kind of rich funness, kind of getting students to also learn to enjoy the process, learn to enjoy printmaking as well. And I think that part of teaching is really, really, really interesting as well. And it segues into kind of when Ali asked me to kind of exhibit here rather than focusing on my own work, I decided, hey, can we show a student portfolio? So it was fun to have the Fish House portfolio here, which I should have brought with me, but I didn't. Is that it? That's it. Since you're here, though, I will say that again, after this, the opening for the show at Artswin is happening, or if you need to make a trip down to Owensboro, the memorial exhibition for John Shartug is currently up through February. If you heard about that, Katie, that John passed away, I think 2 months ago. Yeah. And I, from what I've heard from Shay, they really haven't done any other sort of formal memorial. His family hasn't done anything else, so I think this is also being done as kind of the memorial for John's life anyway. Anyway, thank you. I'd like to again thank the Evansville Vanderbilt Libraries and Allie for having me speak and talk. And I'd love for questions. If you guys want to look at prints, we should do that.
Yeah.